Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the New Review of Film and Television Studies podcast. My name is Max Bledstein, and I'm web and social media editor for the New Review of Film and Television Studies. I'm also a casual academic at the University of New South Wales, where I teach on film and media. And I'm really excited to be here with today's guest, Professor Adam Lowenstein, to talk about his latest book, Horror, Film and Otherness. I'll tell you a bit more about Adam now. Adam is professor of English and Film and Media Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. In addition to Horror, Film and Otherness, he is also the author of Dreaming of Cinema, Spectatorship, Surrealism in the Age of Digital Media, and Shocking Representation, Historical Trauma, National Cinema, and the Modern Horror Film, all published by Columbia University Press. Adam is especially invested in horror studies and is the director of Pitt's Horror Studies Working Group, as well as a board member of the George A. Romero Foundation. He played a central role in the acquisition of the George A. Romero collection for Pitt's Horror Studies Archive. He has held visiting professorships at Columbia University, New York University, and Tel Aviv University, and received a McGeorge Fellowship from the University of Melbourne, as well as a Guggenheim Fellowship from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Max. It's great to be here with you.
So I do want to talk today primarily about your latest book, which I think is wonderful. First of all, I work on horror cinema myself, and I've found the arguments really provocative. I've already given a conference presentation where I've worked with some of the concepts from your book, and I'm really excited to see over the coming years, honestly, how scholars make use of the ideas that you've introduced here. So I'd really like to kind of tease those out today. So I wanted to start by...
First of all, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I wanted to start by kind of getting you to tell us maybe a bit about the core argument in your book. Your argument revolves around a contrast you draw with the work of the late critic Robin Wood. So could you start by telling us a bit about who Robin Wood was and how you agree and disagree with him?
Well, Robin Wood is quite understandably thought of as one of the foundational figures of film and media studies. He was a critic who really helped shape the field as we know it, doing important work on everything from Hitchcock to politics in film, to gender in film, to sexuality in film. So his work has been very influential for me and for many others. I really felt like this book needed to address Robin's work centrally because it's been so influential for creating what is now an emergent field in its own right, which is horror studies. And Robin's essay, An Introduction to the American Horror Film, which he published in 1979, has been particularly essential for setting the terms for what horror studies is and what it does and what it believes in. So I really am very indebted to Robin Wood for the work that he's done, because there's no way I could do the work that I do without him. And I was very lucky to be able to tell him this in person when I met him back in 1999 at a conference at NYU that was celebrating Alfred Hitchcock's 100th birthday. And I was able to tell him that, and it meant a lot to me to be able to do that, and for him to be able to hear it. And this book is of course an argument in many ways with his work, but it's also a celebration of his work, because there's no way that horror studies could exist, or that I could do the work that I do without the work that Robin has done.
Thanks. So maybe could you expand a bit and tell us about what that argument is, what Robin's core argument in an introduction to the American horror film is, and how it is that you agree and disagree with that. Because as you say, it's an argument, and his work has been very influential. And I certainly don't read the book as a complete repudiation of Wood. So could you tell us a bit more
No,
about that?
it's not a repudiation of Wood. It's really a spirited conversation with him. And I think about there's a great book by Charles Barr, the scholar Charles Barr, called English Hitchcock, and he describes the book as an ongoing discussion with Robin Wood, also, where he says his sort of response to Robin is yes, but. And he sees that as sort of the ultimate compliment in many ways, the yes but response. And I see what I'm doing in conversation with Robin Wood's work to be similar. One of the things that Robin Wood was able to accomplish with an introduction to the American horror film and the retrospective of horror films that he screened at the Toronto Film Festival in 1979 in collaboration with Richard Lipp is he was really able to make a strong case for taking the horror film seriously as politics, as something that matters to the culture. And I also believe that the horror film matters to culture, to politics, to history, and to art and aesthetics. So we're agreed there. The place where my argument differs is I really think about the horror film's relation to otherness, which is social difference, as a matter of transformation and metamorphosis, rather than the sort of fixed categories that Robin Wood came up with by telling us that the basic formula for all horror films is normality is threatened by the monster, and when that formula is applied to how the films work, you come up with either a progressive horror film that deals with the elements of normality and monstrosity in a way that's progressive, and then a wing of horror films that deal with the categories of normality and monstrosity in a way that he deems reactionary. So in short, there's a sort of a classification system that's built into Wood's critical model that really does put the films into certain categories and sort of evaluates them as fixed in that way. So my model is more in process, I guess, and sort of more open to ambiguities and contingencies, and the idea of what I call transformative otherness. This idea that the other and normality are really always transforming one into the other, into the other, into the other, rather than things that are oppositional and sort of begin at opposite poles and then conflict and then sort of go back to their opposite poles. So transformative otherness is what I've put in the place of Robin Wood's progressive and reactionary categorizations of horror.
Excellent. And this idea of transformative otherness and material from the book's first chapter, in which you really unpack this concept, first appeared in an essay called A Reintroduction to the American Horror Film, which was published in the Wiley-Blackwell History of American Film in 2012. It's over 10 years later now. Has your thinking about transformative otherness changed since then, or has this just been sort of a single idea that you've been waiting to address in this book until now?
Oh, it's changed a lot. Transformative otherness is not a term I use in that first version of the argument at all. It's not a term that I had come up with at that point. So that's a major difference between the early version and the book version. But I think another thing that's really different in terms of context between 2012 and now is precisely the emergence of horror studies as a field. And I think I really thought hard about what I wanted this book to do to help scholars who are working in horror studies, or scholars who are interested in the idea of horror studies and maybe have not experienced it. I wanted to provide a sort of map for the past, present, and future of horror studies, and I wanted to make sure there was a way for readers to understand where did horror studies come from, what are the sorts of arguments that put eventually horror studies on the map, and then what are the sorts of things we should be thinking about and weighing as we think about what kind of future does horror studies have, and where do we want it to go. And I'm a firm believer that if we don't consider the past alongside our present and our wishes for the future, then we're not in the most advantageous position. So I really wanted to make sure that the book laid out this map and could be, to the best of my ability, as helpful to as many scholars and fans and enthusiasts and just curious parties as I could possibly address.
And along those lines, I'm kind of interested in your own relationship with Wood's work. I know you said that you had a chance to meet him, and you've talked about how his work has been very influential for you. And I know for myself that I first read An Introduction to the American Horror Film in undergrad. We watched Night of the Living Dead and used Wood's ideas to talk about this idea of the politics of the horror film, which, as you're saying, is in itself very influential, because that was not an idea that was widely taken up at the time. And so that has been an essay that has continued to stick with me. And so I'm curious if you sort of read it the first time and thought, well, this isn't quite there, was there a point where you realized that you thought there were limitations to this argument?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it sends me sort of down memory lane, in the sense that when I was an undergraduate student and I was writing a thesis at the end of my undergraduate years, and the two most important scholarly sources that I can recall at this point for my work, and it was a thesis, surprise, surprise, on David Cronenberg, which has been a point of obsession for me for a long time. I've yet to write a book without a Cronenberg chapter in it, and Horror, Film, and Otherness is no exception. So I was writing about Cronenberg, and the two sources that seemed essential to me were Carol Clover's Men, Women, and Chainsaws, which had been recently published at that point, and Robin Wood's Introduction to the American Horror Film. And these two sources just seemed like godsends to me. I mean, they were the things I could look at and say, look, I'm not crazy. I can talk about horror films in a serious, scholarly way, and I'm not just a lunatic alone in the wilderness. There are these other smart people who have done this work and who have said compelling things, and so I have people to be in conversation with. So right from the beginning, Robin Wood was crucial to me, but also right from the beginning, he was a big problem for me, because his opinion of David Cronenberg's films was the exact opposite of mine. Everything that I found sort of fascinating and compelling and admirable and impressive about Cronenberg's work, he found detestable, really. And sort of, as much as I saw Cronenberg as sort of the heart of why I was interested in horror, I think Wood really felt like Cronenberg was the the sort of the apex of how horror can go wrong, and how, you know, his reactionary category was really embodied spectacularly well by Cronenberg. And for Wood, a reactionary film is not a film that he likes or approves of or wants to champion. So in hindsight, it was great, because if Robin Wood had felt the same way about Cronenberg as I had, I would have had much less fuel for my engine to talk about Cronenberg in a different way. And of course, Robin had talked about him so differently than I had, but he'd done it in a really smart and compelling way. And so I was off and running. So that was the beginning of a long critical conversation with Wood that continues in horror, film, and otherness.
And I have the sense from what you're just saying, and of course from reading your work, that you do feel this very personal connection to the work of David Cronenberg. And you start this book off with these very personal reflections on the 2018 massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue and George Romero's passing in 2017, and how you've reflected on your own identity as a Jew living in Pittsburgh in relation to these events. So could you tell us a bit more about how you think about horror in relation to these events, and what made you decide to discuss them in this book?
Sure thing. Yeah. I mean, to me, horror has always been uh, uh, personal as well as professional. I was a fan of the horror genre long before I became a professor, and my enthusiasm for the films has not been dulled at all by being a professor. So for me, horror is something that's always been close to me, as well as something that's been work that I take seriously. So I think this moment in 2018, where I was working on a project with a great group of collaborators across the city of Pittsburgh to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Night of the Living Dead, and to honor the career of George Romero, who had passed away recently. To have that sort of wind up coinciding with the awful shootings at the Tree of Life Synagogue really sort of forced me in many ways to look more closely at this personal / professional relationship I had to horror, and the question of, you know, what does horror in the fictional genre sense sort of mean or matter when you're encountering such devastating real life horror like the anti-Semitic killings at Tree of Life. And especially at a time when the entire city is on the one hand celebrating George Romero's amazing career and accomplishments, and then on the other hand reeling from this awful attack. And you know, can you put these two things together? Should you put these two things together? Must we put these two things together? Going through that myself really was the genesis of the book, and I really felt like horror in the fictional genre sense is not lived sense. It's actually a very important resource for us to think about and confront and recognize real life horror. And so for me, especially as a Jew in Pittsburgh at that moment, it really felt like horror had a lot to teach me and tell me about how to process something as unthinkable and devastating as the Tree of Life killings.
Excellent, thank you. And on that note, I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the films and filmmakers you discuss in this book. We've talked about Cronenberg a bit, but he's only one part of the book. So could you tell us more about the thinking behind the selection of your case studies for exploring this idea of transformative otherness?
Yeah, sure. Again, back to that idea of wanting to sort of provide a map for the past, present, and future of horror studies. I really tried to sort of select my cases in a way that would resonate with that mission. So the first part of the book is really largely an engagement with Robin Wood's work, and so I touch on films that meant a lot to him, especially in Introduction to the American Horror Film. So Halloween and The Omen and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre get a lot of attention in the first chapter. And then in the second chapter, a film that Robin Wood does not talk about, which is The Shout, occupies the center of chapter 2, but along lines that would sort of suggest, which is his interest in the connection between surrealism and horror, which appears in the Introduction to the American Horror Film, but it's not sort of the center of the essay. But my chapter on The Shout sort of extrapolates that with a film that really sort of straddles the line between horror and art, between genre and surrealism, and sort of pushes the idea that surrealism is worth thinking about under the umbrella of horror. So that's a way of sort of putting in the piece of the map that responds directly to Robin Wood's work. And then the second part of the book deals with canonical horror filmmakers that are sort of essential to understanding the modern horror film, and that's Tobe Hooper, director most famously of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it's George Romero, director most famously of Night of the Living Dead, and it's David Cronenberg, who we've touched on already. So there, I wanted to make sure I was addressing filmmakers that would be recognizable to people who are interested in horror, either deeply or just glancingly. So I wanted to have those recognizable names be addressed, but also to be addressed in unusual ways. And the films in those chapters are not always the typical films that are focused on when those filmmakers are studied. So with Tobe Hooper, we're getting not just the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but things like The Funhouse and Life Force and Poltergeist. And with George Romero, we're really focusing on Martin rather than Night of the Living Dead or Dawn of the Dead or the other sequels to Night of the Living Dead. And with Cronenberg, we're looking at The Brood and Scanners, which are important early films, but then also later films like Maps to the Stars and A Dangerous Method, films that lots of critics say have nothing to do with horror at all, and really don't merit discussion in conjunction with Cronenberg's earlier work in any way. But I sort of try to make a case through Jewishness as a lens to understand Cronenberg that they do belong. And then finally, there's a part 3 to the book that is more geared towards the future of horror studies, with lesser known directors who hopefully by the time somebody else writes a book like this, decades down the road, will be canonical figures. So looking at Marina Devon's In My Skin, Stephanie Rothman's Velvet Vampire, Jennifer Kent's The Babadook in one chapter, and then in another chapter looking at Jordan Peele's Get Out alongside Roman Polanski and Ira Levin's Rosemary's Baby, and then Kurt Siodmak's screenplay for The Wolfman from 1941. The book sort of lays out roughly as sort of coordinates on a map to give a sense of the past, present, and future of horror studies, and that's the general shape, I think.
And I'm curious if you had any thoughts, maybe reflecting on that kind of generational divide. That did you see a marked contrast between the way people like Romero and Carpenter and Cronenberg and Hooper were treating transformative otherness relative to younger directors like Peele and Kent? Is there a contrast there?
There's definitely generational differences, as one would expect and hope. I think, and one of the most striking ones, I think, for people like Jordan Peele and Jennifer Kent, who are sort of building very consciously and skillfully on the accomplishments of their predecessors, they're really able to make some moves that the earlier directors don't, and they're able to treat certain things in an explicit way that the earlier directors only treat in an implicit way. So, for example, if we compare the treatment of race in something like Romero's Night of the Living Dead up against race in something like Jordan Peele's Get Out, we see a very different approach in terms of how foregrounded in an explicit way race can be in Peele's film versus the way it sort of occupies a crucial but implicit place in Romero's film. And I do think that's a marked change that has come over time. And there's something similar if you think about Jennifer Kent and the Babadook up against something like Carpenter's Halloween, right? In Halloween, we get Laurie, the strong woman figure who's really a teen babysitter and not sort of a woman of the world like we get in the Babadook with Amelia, who's not just a mother but a single mother who's endured the death of her spouse. I mean, this is a woman in the world in a much more mature and complicated way than Laurie could be in Halloween. So again, a deeper sort of engagement with the sort of explicit ideas of race or gender that are there in the earlier films, but in an implicit way rather than an explicit way. So that's one change that I see. But then on the other hand, there are exceptions. Like I think, one of the reasons I included Stephanie Rothman's Velvet Vampire in that chapter is that even though it's a film from 1971, I feel like it's a film that still has not been discovered to the degree that it should be. And in many ways, in that film, the desire we see established between the characters of Diane and Susan is sort of still ahead of the curve for a lot of contemporary horror. So I think we with horror, the past isn't always past, and I think putting Stephanie Rothman's work together with that of Marina Devon and Jennifer Kent is a way to remind us of that. And there's a similar move in the other chapter with Peele and Polanski and Levin alongside Kurt Siodmak, who's writing The Wolfman in 1941.
And something else that came out over that response is that in your discussion of transformative otherness, that you bring this idea up in relation to a number of different identity categories that we just talked about: race and gender, but we also get age, class, and religion. Did you find that there's a difference in how transformative otherness operates in relation to these different categories?
Yes, I mean, for me, it really is about the films first as individual examples, and I really try to work as much as I can from the bottom up rather than the top down. So these chapters are all really anchored by close readings of the films themselves, rather than sort of, here's my theory, here's my categories, now watch how the films fit my model. It really is supposed to be the opposite. It's looking at the films in a detailed enough way that the ideas emerge from the films, rather than the theory being sort of plunked on top of the films and made to fit in that way. So each one of the films that I look at through the lenses that I do could be looked at through completely different lenses and have quite different conclusions drawn from them. So, for example, Jewishness is the lens that I use to think about Cronenberg's work. But of course, as we know from lots of previous work, we could say use gender to look at Cronenberg's films and get quite different things out of the analysis in that way. Similarly to Romero, I'm focusing on class when it comes to Martin, but as we know, again, looking at Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, a number of other Romero films that have prominent African-American protagonists, race is also something we could talk about in relation to Romero's films, and again, the conclusions would be quite different, I think. So I'm not saying that each of the films or each of the categories works the same in a sort of cookie cutter way. It really does depend on the conjuncture between the film and the critical lens that's being applied.
I think I'd like to work through that conjuncture a bit more now, because a number of these chapters combine discussion of a film that I would expect to some degree to see in a horror studies book. I think you do make a good point, absolutely, about addressing under-discussed works in a number of these cases, but the films themselves certainly don't seem out of place in a horror studies book. But the theoretical lenses, the ideas that you combine them with, I did find to often be more unexpected. So I'd be curious to hear more about these individual combinations and how you came to them. Starting with your chapter on the shout, I was particularly fascinated by your use of James Clifford's concept of ethnographic surrealism to discuss Jerzy Skolimowski's The Shout from 1978. Can you tell us a bit more about Clifford's idea and how you decided to apply it to The Shout?
Yeah, I had published a book previous to Horror, Film and Otherness called Dreaming of Cinema, that was about surrealism, spectatorship, and digital media, and so surrealism has always been a point of fascination for me too, and the connections between horror and surrealism, I think, are very suggestive and productive, and not as thoroughly explored as you might imagine, given that surrealism has occupied so much real estate in art history and in literary studies and a number of other areas. But it did feel to me like The Shout was an opportunity to think about surrealism and horror and how they might be connected, because The Shout really exists right at that intersection, and for good reasons. I mean, Skolimowski, as we know, is a major figure of the art cinema, Polish cinema, of British cinema, of emigre cinema. And he was a student of ethnography earlier in his life. So he had that to draw upon by the time he got to the Shout. And it just seemed like this was a film that very compellingly captured this concept that James Clifford, the anthropologist and historian, came up with in his work, Ethnographic Surrealism, to talk about the idea that in interwar France, the science of ethnography and the art of surrealism were not nearly as neatly divided and defined as we have them now. So it really was a time where ethnography could be more like art and surrealism could be more like science, and that there was not a sort of clear demarcation between the two of them, and that the net result of that is something that we still can learn from, which is the idea that the familiar can be investigated as something strange, and the strange can be investigated as something familiar, under this rubric of ethnographic surrealism, where we're looking at ourselves and the things that we think we know through the lens of a sort of ethnographer who's looking at things that are not familiar, that are other in some kind of way. And that we can sort of switch that lens around and learn important things by doing it. And the Shout just seems sort of really open to that sort of analysis, because it's a film that's premised on the idea that this white British man has claimed that he's spent the last 20 years in the Australian outback among Aboriginal people, and he's sort of brought back this Aboriginal magic with him that includes what he calls a terror shout, which is a shout that is so powerful that it kills anything living within its radius, and that's the sort of heart of the film. But it's a very complicated film, and we're never really able to take the testimony of that character without a grain of salt, or two or three or several hundred, actually. And it's a film where we really are constantly sort of reminded that our instinct to want to put things into categories of self and familiar or other and strange are impulses that we need to question and interrogate rather than just follow blindly.
Thanks. And the next combination that I'd like you to ask you about is the chapter on Cronenberg. You put the films of Cronenberg in dialogue with the work of the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas and the Frankfurt School film theorist Siegfried Kracauer. And as you say, you're not saying that this is the only thing to be said about Cronenberg, and Cronenberg has been written about so much from so many other angles. Particularly these three I had not come across outside of your work. So I'd be curious to hear more about how these thinkers, and I think they really all are thinkers, albeit very disparate ones, how do they speak to each other?
Yes. Since the lens I am looking at Cronenberg through in this book is Jewishness, I tried to bring to bear the contours of what I would call Jewish film theory to talk about Cronenberg, and Levinas and Kracauer are figures that I would include there. Kracauer more centrally, Levinas more marginally, but both great thinkers who happen to be Jewish and happen to have been touched by World War II and the Holocaust, and in profound ways that shaped their thinking throughout their post-war lives. I think that the aspects of what Levinas is theorizing with his sort of ethics and what he calls the optics of face-to-face encounters is as helpful for thinking about Cronenberg's work and its relation to Jewishness as Krakauer's ideas about what he calls the realistic tendency in cinema are, and how that really springs in many ways from a sense on Krakauer's part that we bear a responsibility to testifying to events like the Holocaust, and that film has a role to play in allowing us to engage with unthinkable events like that might not be able to be engaged in real life without the mediation of cinema. So to me, these thinkers really help us to put Cronenberg within a trajectory and a genealogy that he's not often attached to, and I think helps us see the films in a new and different way, and it brings to the forefront aspects of his work that haven't been really given the attention they deserve. Thinking, for example, about his short film At the Suicide of the Last Jew in the World and the Last Cinema in the World, where he casts himself in the title role, the centrality of Jewishness to A Dangerous Method, where he's really tracing the disintegration of the relationship between Freud and Jung along lines that have to do with Freud's Jewishness and Jung's inability to sort of understand what that might mean. And then, of course, Sabina Spielreim's Jewishness, the woman who sort of comes between them, as a crucial factor in that history and in that evolution of psychoanalysis that the film addresses. So that was the idea with putting Cronenberg into that sort of context that would include figures like Levinas and Krakauer rather than excluding him from that sort of circle of consideration.
And Jewishness does come into play in your final chapter as well, where you bring the work of Jordan Peele together with the novelists Ira Levin and Kurt Siodmak. What led you to bring these three together?
Well, it started with Jordan Peele himself. He's been very open and vocal about saying that he is a graduate of the Ira Levin School of Writing, which really I think means that for Jordan Peele, reading novels like Rosemary's Baby and The Stepford Wives and The Boys from Brazil has been a crucial part of his approach to writing and to directing, and you can see the marks of Ira Levin all over Jordan Peele's work, and so when I knew that Levin was such an important figure for Jordan Peele, I started doing more digging into that connection and into Levin's work. And what I really found is that one of the things that connects them is that in a certain way, what Peele is doing for the African-American experience in relation to horror is something that Levin was doing for the Jewish American experience in relation to horror with those novels. And that without equating, of course, the African-American experience and the Jewish American experience, that there are striking points of intersection and opportunities to sort of think together along those lines around, what does race mean in film? What does ethnicity mean in film? What does otherness mean in film and in horror in particular? So that's sort of where it began, and the digging sort of, as I dug deeper and deeper and went beyond Levin, sort of back to the sorts of things that predated Levin. I really felt like Kurt Siodmak was a fascinating case for an older tradition of thinking about Jewish horror, in that Siodmak was like Krakauer, a German Jew who had to flee Hitler's regime, and for Siodmak, he had to do time in Switzerland and England and France before he made it to America. And when he arrived in America in 1937, he, like Krakauer, had to establish a whole new career and a whole new language. And for Siodmak, that career path was to take up the work he had been doing in Germany, which was writing novels and writing screenplays. And two of the early works that he was able to complete are still very influential for us, which is the screenplay for The Wolfman, 1941, and the novel Donovan's Brain from 1942, which has been filmed a number of times and has also influenced lots and lots of other books and films, and finds its way into the workings of Get Out as well, if not in a conscious way, in a sort of unconscious way.
We're getting towards the end of our time now. I would like to hear you talk a bit more about the first chapter, and particularly your engagement with this other aspect of horror that Wood was quite critical of, in addition to Cronenberg, which was the slasher. And in that chapter, you close read the film Halloween to illustrate some of the limitations of Wood's critiques. And Wood, as you know very well, is far from the only critic who has maligned the slasher in this way. Plenty of people who are very enthusiastic about horror generally say, yeah, but slasher is not so much for me. But even those people who are very critical of slashers, among those, there are some that see Halloween as an exception to the weaknesses of this subgenre. Do you agree that Halloween is this kind of exceptional slasher, or do you think that we see transformative otherness within this subgenre beyond the film?
I mean, I think it's important in terms of understanding where Wood is coming from when he has such an antipathy towards the slasher film, is that he really is a critic first, and he held posts in academic institutions, but he worked as a critic, and that's sort of where he sort of came from. And I don't think he ever considered himself an academic. He considered himself a working and teaching critic. And so I think, like any critic, if you're exposed to a wave of films in a very short period of time that seems to be doing largely the same thing over and over again, without much variation or imagination, I think it's very easy to get jaded and sort of despairing about the state of a genre that you care about, that seems to be going through a kind of a repetition compulsion in some kind of way. So I'm sympathetic to that. But I also feel like with the point of view we are able to inhabit, here in 2023, we can see that the slasher subgenre is really one of the most durable and popular forms of the horror film that has ever existed. And it's far from being, something that's limited to the 1980s. I mean, it's very much part of the cinematic present tense. So to dismiss the slasher seems like a hasty thing to do, if only because its popularity is so so durable and steadfast. And I think, you know, what we can see with the benefit of hindsight is how the slasher film is actually a wider phenomenon than we originally imagined. And when we start thinking about things like, oh, you know, how much is the Italian giallo a sort of a precursor to the slasher film, and what would happen if we thought about Italian giallo films as slasher films, or slasher films as giallo films. So switching the focus not just from America to Italy, but then also Italy back to America, is one way of sort of expanding our sense of what the slasher film can encompass. The same sort of way I think there's important elements in J-horror films that take their cues from slasher movies. You think about, you know, we have Final Girl like protagonists in films like Ring and Dark Water, and The Grudge, and that's an important part of their syntax. So if we sort of broaden our scope of what the slasher film can encompass, I think we can see a little bit more easily how Halloween is not a standalone exception. It's a accomplished version of a form that has many accomplished examples, whether it's from Italian giallo or J-horror, or higher end examples like The Silence of the Lambs or Zodiac. Those are slasher films too, and also something like It Follows, you know, which is a sort of really skilled contemporary mashup, I guess, of elements that we would consider Italian slasher or J-horror or Italian giallo, high-end elements, low-end elements. It Follows takes them all and mixes them all together and gives us a slasher film that is very much original, very much alive, but also very much recognizable as a slasher film.
So now that you're taking us a bit broader, I thought it might be nice to wrap up by having you tell us a bit about how this book relates to your other work. This is now your third book, in addition to a number of articles and book chapters. You've been thinking through the horror genre in so many different ways. Could you tell us about how this book fits in with your other work, but also does something different?
Yeah, I look across the three books, and I of course see many points of commonality. The horror film clearly is something I can't and probably never will get away from, and that's okay, because I think each of the books thinks about horror in quite different ways. And if Shocking Representation, the first book, was primarily motivated by an interest in the connections between horror and history and trauma, then the second book, Dreaming of Cinema, was really motivated by an interest in the connections between horror and surrealism and digital media. And then Horror, Film and Otherness is really interested in horror's connection to social difference and to mapping horror studies as a field. So all interested in horror, all with chapters on David Cronenberg, but all taking up horror from quite different perspectives. And I guess I can add, the book I'm writing now has the tentative title The Jewish Horror Film, Taboo and Redemption. and it grows right out of horror film and otherness, in that one of the categories of social difference that I explore in horror film and otherness, as we've discussed, is Jewishness. And by the end of horror film and otherness, I just felt like there's so much material there that didn't get into the book that it really deserves a book of its own. And so now I'm engaged in that work. What is a Jewish horror film, and what can we learn from it? And primarily, really front and center is my gut instinct that the deeper we look at Jewish horror, the more it shifts from a sort of marginal tradition within the horror film, with examples like the Golem or the Dybbuk, and the more it becomes a central tradition in the horror film. And yes, I can tell you there will be a chapter on David Cronenberg. And it has to do with the connection between Cronenberg's The Fly and Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. And here we have two great masters of Jewish horror working along lines that really intersect in fascinating ways. And Cronenberg has always talked about The Fly as his version of The Metamorphosis. But for both of these creators, Jewishness has been not usually the central category that's been used to think about them, largely because Jewishness is hardly anywhere explicit in their work. But I think for both artists, understanding Jewishness as a context for their creativity really enriches our sense of what they're doing and what they're after and what we learn from them. And to think of them together, my hope is to shed light on Cronenberg that comes through Kafka, and shed light on Kafka that comes through Cronenberg. And the lens to do that is Jewish horror.
Excellent. Well, I'm really excited to see that project develop. Um, Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much for your time today. You've done a really amazing job of taking us through your book, telling us about your thinking about horror beyond the book. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Just that it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Max, and I am an admirer of your work as well, and I think of you among many other great young scholars working to make horror studies a field that matters. And your work and your energy is something that keeps us all going. So thank you, and it's been great to talk with you about this, and looking forward to further conversations.
That's very kind, Adam. I really appreciate that. So thank you for your time today. Adam Lowenstein, professor of film and media studies. The book is Horror, Film and Otherness. There's a link for a discount code on the episode page, so please check that out, and take care. Bye.